I'll let people get sorted out here. Thanks for showing out to what even I consider to be a pretty obscure topic, a pretty obscure local history topic. The geologists Arnold Hague and Thomas Jaggar made 2 expeditions for the USGS through parts of Yellowstone and the Absaroka Mountains, one of them in 1893 and another in 1897. And today we're going to talk about the 1893 trip. We just don't have time to talk about everything. And this project was inspired by Jaggar's journals, which were edited and published by Bruce Blevins in book form back in 2002. I really recommend that you read this if you can get a copy of it. It's out of print. It's been out of print for a long time, and there's not very many copies floating around. And I really fell in love with this book and the photos just because I love the historical geography of the area. And this is all about historical geography. And I know that Thomas Jaggar isn't a super well-known name around here. And you might know of Jaggar Peak, which is on the divide between Sunlight and the North Fork. And when I tell people I'm working on a Jaggar project, they kind of say, who? Mick Jaggar? And to my knowledge, Mick Jaggar has never been to Cody. He's never been to the Absarokas. It seems conceivable he probably visited Yellowstone, but I've never found any evidence of that. But Jaggar Peak is not named after Mick Jaggar. It's named after Tom Jaggar. And I know he doesn't look like much of a rock star, but he was a geologist, so maybe he was a different kind of rock star. And he's not well known in Wyoming, and that's because he spent most of his professional life in Hawaii, studying volcanic geology out there. And after a few years working for the USGS and being a geology professor at Harvard and MIT, Jaggar established the Volcano Experiment Station in Hawaii, and he helped create the Hawaii Volcanoes National Park in 1935, and he sort of became the chief volcanologist for the National Park Service out there. So his time studying the Absarokas, geology of the Absarokas, really sort of fits with all this volcano stuff because, as you probably know, the Absarokas are volcanic mountains. We have numerous extinct volcanoes around here, and Jaggar is one of the early interpreters of that geologic history. And when he came out here to Wyoming in 1893, he had just graduated from Harvard with a bachelor in geology, and he intended to continue his education. So getting field experience would be a helpful thing for his resume. So he signed on as a volunteer assistant geologist, basically today what we would call an unpaid intern, to go on a 3-month trip through the Absarokas. His food, his travel, his sort of expedition expenses were paid, but he was not paid anything for his time. So he must have really wanted to go. These are the guys on this 1893 expedition. We have Tom Jaggar right here. This is Arnold Hague. This is John Anderson, the cook, and he's maybe the most interesting character. He was born in Oklahoma to the parents. One of his parents was a slave. The other was a Cherokee Indian. He fought in the Civil War, came up to Montana during the gold rush, the Montana gold rush, did more than his fair share of Indian fighting, and was kind of an all-around mountain man in early Bozeman. And then this is Fred Koch, the lead packer, and John Condiff, the assistant packer. And Fred Koch was a professional packer that Hague and other USGS surveyors sort of employed all around the Rocky Mountains. So he was leading these USGS surveys down in Colorado and Wyoming and Montana. He was everywhere. And the leader of this whole project is Arnold Hague. When Congress created the USGS in 1879, Hague was appointed one of the first geologists. In 1883, he was put in charge of the Geological Survey of Yellowstone, of which he would be there for a long time. And this kind of cements Hague as one of the premier authorities of the Yellowstone region and its geology. And as such, he really rubbed shoulders with a lot of notable men who were interested in early Yellowstone, like George Bird Grinnell and Theodore Roosevelt. And through all these connections, he becomes really active in the early conservation movement to protect Yellowstone. He's even an honorary member of the Boone and Crockett Club, even though he's not a hunter. And you probably know that it's pretty hard to get into a club like that. For many years, Hague had been lobbying to increase the size of Yellowstone, which never really went anywhere until President Benjamin Harrison created the Yellowstone Timberland Reserve in 1891. And this was the first national forest. It was later expanded in 1907 with much more complicated boundaries. This is a 1892 General Land Office map, and if you actually look at it, it's horribly inaccurate, but it shows the boundaries of the early Yellowstone Timber Reserve right there. And the purpose of these USGS expeditions was to survey this Yellowstone Park Timber Reserve. Now, when the original Timber Reserve was created, there was sort of this not fully articulated assumption that it would at some point in the near future be an extension of Yellowstone. And that doesn't come about for a variety of reasons. But partially because of this assumption, no one really knows what's supposed to be happening with this. Is it supposed to be preserved like the park? Because it might become part of the park. Can people mine and homestead and ranch in the park boundaries, or in the Yellowstone Timberland Reserve boundaries? There are already people settled in the boundaries of the reserve when it was created. And this sort of creates complications. So it's all bureaucratically hazy. No one really knows what the long-term plan is for the timber reserve. And the folks from the US government and the USGS want to officially know what's going on in the timber reserve, so they will be able to articulate a vision for what's supposed to be happening with this. And from the 1893 and 1897 expeditions, Hague wrote what's called the Absaroka Folio, and we have an original copy in the Park County Archives. It mostly explains the geology of the region, which we don't really need to go in depth on. If you're super interested in local geology, I suggest that you might read this. I'm not going to talk about geology much today because I'm totally unqualified to do that. And I know a lot of you are saying, well, that's never stopped you before, Brian. The Absaroka Folio also included the first official USGS maps of the area, the Crandall Quad and the Ishua Quad. And Hague and Jaggar weren't mapping the landscape on their trip. They were looking at geology. But the USGS had a simultaneous surveying party in the Absarokas who were out there, mapping this, putting names on attaching names to places, peaks, creeks, which is where we get Jaggar Peak and Jaggar Creek, because of course people from the USGS are going to name geographical points after other USGS people. As part of his work, Jaggar kept journals and comments on geology and examinations of rock specimens. And the Jaggar collection, all this material, exists down in the USGS library at the Federal Center in Denver. Jaggar also took about 300 images, both in 1893 and 1897, using glass plate, negatives, and film cameras. And not all of these photos turned out great, because developing photos in the field was understandably super hard and time-consuming, and Jaggar just wasn't a photographer. He was a geologist. And for all those photos that Jaggar kept, 90 have been preserved. And they're here down in the Federal Center. I think there's 3 in the Yellowstone Research Center up in Gardner. And I visited this archive in March of 2020 because I wanted to get a copy of these journals and digital copies of all these photos because I wanted to start re-photographing them. And then 3 days, I think 2 or 3 days after we left, the Research Center closed for a couple years because of COVID. So I was lucky to get in there. And then in the summer of 2020, with literally nothing else to do, I started, the only term for it would be recreationally, scouting out Jaggar photo locations and trying to photograph these images because it was just a great excuse to get outside and study history simultaneously. And it's important to make clear that historical research doesn't have to always take the form of reading dusty documents in a dark basement. It can also be getting outside and exploring around. Historic rephotography is a way to document landscape changes. Usually it's not implemented in wilderness settings because remote places aren't highly photographed, and it's difficult to locate precise spots in the middle of nowhere. But I brought some books, if you're interested afterwards, some other rephotography books from Yellowstone and the Rocky Mountains. And the rationale for this rephotography project like this is that heritage resources also comprise historic geography. As an archivist, I really approached this project with the intent to use Jaggar's photos and journals to study the historical geography of the Absarokas. And I will freely admit that I am not a professional photographer. I kind of know my way around a camera and its basic functionality. But Jaggar wasn't a photographer either. And these aren't Ansel Adams photographs. They're not meant to be breathtaking. They're meant to be documentary images. Think of it like an insurance claims adjuster taking a photo of your dented car. They're just trying to document what it looks like. And locating these image perspectives and visiting the sites in the field was sometimes a huge endeavor of time and energy. Some images were pretty close to roads. Others required a big day hike. Some are ride-along modern trails. Others require nasty bushwhacking or slogging up steep slopes. And once at a photo site, I often lacked the luxury of waiting around for the correct light conditions or the correct angle of the sun to really duplicate the original image. I just had to get what I could get and get out of there. So it is what it is, and hope we had good weather and no forest fire smoke. Visiting these photos these photo sites on day hikes and on weekends was a great excuse to get outside and explore. But some of these Jaggar photos were too remote for a long walk, making it logistically difficult to visit these more remote locations. So last year I applied for a small grant from the Wyoming Historical Society to help fund a pack trip up the South Fork to Marston Pass, to the Continental Divide, and then over into the headwaters of the Yellowstone and then down into the Thoroughfare and back to the South Fork, all the while hitting about a dozen of these remote Jaggar photo locations. And this was an unusual project for this type of grant application, but I sort of spelled out the articles I wanted to write and the talks like this that I would give and talk about how history is cool and fun. So to my surprise, they bid on this. So I really appreciate the Wyoming Historical Society funding an unconventional project like this. And I can't thank me, Dominic, and 70 Ranch Outfitting, and Spencer Strike, and Silas Ward enough for making this trip happen on what little I could actually pay you. So this trip was a great success. We covered a lot of ground in 6 days. It was the hottest portion of last summer, which was a hot summer. And we had good weather, and most importantly, no smoky skies, which would have made landscape photography difficult or impossible. So after 4 years of hiking around and bushwhacking, I've rephotographed 55 of Jaggar's photos, and I'm more or less happy with those. Some of them are just not worth photographing again because they're like super zoomed in on specific rocks, and other ones are pretty remote, and maybe I'll get to those again, maybe I won't, I don't know. Yeah, of course. This is Pass Creek, up by the Thoroughfare. We'll talk more about this later. This is Jim Mountain. This is from the 1897 trip. And people are always saying that landscapes change and evolve, and I think we know that on some level, but to me that's all kind of just an abstract concept until we can actually juxtapose before and after photos to see exactly how things have changed or haven't changed. That's equally as useful. But I still have some photo locations to get to, so we'll see where this goes. The 1893 trip begins when the 5 men convene in Bozeman, Montana in early July of 1893. Fred Koch, the head packer, is already there gathering up supplies. They're going to be out in the mountains for 3 months. In early July, they finally left Bozeman. They go over to Livingston and up Boulder Creek, over to Cook City, and we're going to fast forward through a lot of these early days because it's not in Wyoming or Park County, so who really cares? And this is just transit for these guys too, because their work doesn't really start in earnest until they get down into the Clarks Fork. And they spend a few days in Cook City because it will be their last access to a post office until they get to Marquette. And they need to send off paperwork because, as a lot of you know, even when you're out in the mountains for 3 months, you still can't escape the scourge of constant paperwork. They head down into the Clarks Fork, and their first camp is near the confluence of Pilot Creek. And I should say at this point, this is going to be a geography-heavy program. If you do not enjoy local geography very much, I'm sorry, you came to the wrong presentation, because explaining this is all geography. They shoot a deer for camp meat. This is, again, towards the end of July, and this is completely legal at this point. You can shoot whatever you want, whenever, at any time. It's illegal to shoot an animal in the park, so they have to wait until they're out of the park to shoot anything. The next day, Jaggar climbs one of these big rock outcroppings across the river to get a good view in the valley. And I'm going to use red stars in these maps to denote campsites and yellow stars to show photo points. And he takes this photo of Pilot and Index Peak. You can see the river right here. This is Pilot Creek coming in. The modern highway kind of runs right through here. And this was a nasty photo to get. Required a lot of bushwhacking. You can see there's a lot more tree growth. So his route up on this rock outcropping was probably pretty clear, but it is not clear now. And they keep heading down the Clarks Fork Valley. This is the 1899 USGS map, which was printed with the Absaroka folio. And I'll use this when I can because it's a great map to show the landscape as they would have experienced it in their time. And you can see there's already a road running through the Clarks Fork, and that was built in 1885 by investors from Billings who wanted to have access to the Cook City mines from the east. And then you can see the old pack trail going up to Beartooth Lakes and then on over to Red Lodge. Jaggar mentions passing a few isolated ranches. So this is far from a wilderness at this point. There are people living here. These ranches are probably Jim Smith living at what became the B4 Ranch. Then they camp down on Crandall Creek, where there's another ranch with a lot of cattle. And on July 30th, Jaggar and John Anderson, the cook, climb up the big hill to the east of Hunter Peak, and Jaggar, as you can read, almost shoots himself, but he takes this photo looking across the big valley at the mouth of Crandall Creek. These are the Cathedral Cliffs. This is kind of the Swamp Lake area. You can see Lodgepole Creek coming in to Crandall Creek. This is kind of where the Crandall Ranger Station is. On August 1st, they pack up their Crandall camp and take the old trail up Lodgepole Creek into what we call Trail Creek. At this point, it's called Dry Creek. And this spits them out into Sunlight Basin, a little ways, kind of right by the current game and fish cabin. And you can see, again, there's already a road in Sunlight Basin to Frank Chatfield's ranch. And you can also see the forest reserve boundary here. So part of Sunlight Basin and even Crandall is not within this new boundary. Jaggar said there were 3 ranches in the area, but the folio map shows 4 cabins. And these are all identifiable. We know these people. The cabin at the mouth of Beam Gulch was Alpheus Beam. We can just call him Al. He came to the Cook City area in the late 1880s, kind of trapped and market hunted until he settled down in Sunlight Basin. Willard and Ella Ruscher homesteaded the ranch at the mouth of Trail Creek. This is totally gone. You would never know this is here, but we have photos of it. And then Charlie Huff was a young man with a cabin at the mouth of Huff Gulch. And he was a market hunter who trapped bears and hunted animals for their skins and furs. And then he would take them to Billings and Red Lodge and sell them to taxidermists who would then sell them back east to people who, guys in New York City who wanted to have a trophy for their den. And he died in 1900 when he rolled his wagon outside of Red Lodge. Then there's Frank and Kitty Chatfield, and we'll talk about them in a minute. From their camp on Little Sunlight Creek, Jaggar explores around. He climbs up on Little Bald Ridge. He He finds a herd of antelope up there. There's multiple sources that there used to be antelope up in Sunlight Basin. Jaggar takes a photo, some photos of the topography from that ridge above their camp between Little Sunlight and Sunlight Creeks. This is looking downstream to the northeast. You can see Bald Ridge way back there, White Mountain. This is where the current campsite is. This is that big field where everyone always parks their RVs. The road comes over this bench. It's harder to see now. It's a lot more tree cover. They're very interested in these limestone cliffs above camp. This is looking downstream to the southwest. There's this big burned tree trunk here, and there had recently been a forest fire in the area, which is evident in some of these photos. And you can see the current Sunlight Road right there, and I think there was some earth moving along this ridge, because this ridge is kind of different now. This is looking up Little Sunlight Creek. And as you can see, I really hate this photo because there's a lot more tree growth. It's really hard to accurately produce this photo. And this is one of the frustrating parts of this project, because some of these places where Jaggar had taken photos in open meadows or clearings are now just totally overgrown. And we'll see a lot more of that. And I really struggle to split the difference between getting an accurate photo reproduction, which was often just looking at a wall of trees, and getting like an appealing photo where you could see the mountains, see the landscape. This is another photo from that ridge looking into Sunlight Basin. This is probably my favorite photo. Campgrounds right down here, RV place, and then the road comes over this ridge. All these big rocks are still there. The Sunlight locals that Jaggar interacts with are Frank and Kitty Chatfield, who have a cabin and a barn in that pasture north of the creek, on what's now the 70s big pasture across the creek from their ranches. And Frank and Kitty were the first white residents of Sunlight Basin that we know about. I'm sure there were other ones. Frank came to Cook City during that little mining boom in the 1870s and soon realized there was probably more reliable money in feeding miners than there was in actual mining. So he was a market hunter, and Sunlight Basin was a great place to set up and just be a meat hunter. So in 1881, he built this cabin in this natural pasture on the north side of the creek. Hunted for the market, he brought in some dairy cows, and he sold milk and butter and elk meat to miners in Cook City, and then later coal miners in Red Lodge. He was also an early hunting guide to Eastern hunters who wanted to come in and go hunt up in Hoodoo Basin, and even take tours through the park. Frank and Kitty Chatfield also did some prospecting up Sunlight Creek and into the North Fork, and you probably heard me say numerous times, Kitty Creek on the North Fork is named after Kitty Chatfield, because they had a sluicing operation there. And Frank died of cancer in 1879, and Kitty married another guy, and then she died in a really weird way. She died in the Cody Hotel, the old Cody Hotel, which is the first hotel in Cody. It was located where the Silver Dollar Bar patio is. And she was on the second floor sleeping in a room when some drunken cowboys were downstairs playing cards, and one of them had a good hand or something, so they shot up into the ceiling, as you do in the Old West, and a bullet hit Kitty Chatfield, and that's how she died, which is, totally so preventable, but, why would you not shoot into the ceiling? And this is the only photo that I know showing their spread. You can see their cabin and the fence, and then the old road to their ranch right there. And back in 1893, that's where the road ended. Upstream from the Chatfields, there was just a miner's trail. So Jaggar and party broke camp, rode up the mining trail, and camped at the mouth of Galena Creek. There's already some prospecting going on up there, but not a lot of actual mining activity. And that would change a few years later when John Painter comes out to Sunlight hunting, and then he later settles in the Sunlight Basin, and he sort of builds a road up to this area so he can really open up this area to mining. Jaggar climbed the mining trail to study all the dikes across the valley on Dyke Mountain. He's really interested in all these intrusions that sort of, where this rock sort of shoots up through these fissures. I learned a geological term that a group of dikes is called a swarm. So if you didn't learn anything from this, that's my favorite fact. This is looking down Sunlight Creek. And this satellite map is more useful to showing where he actually was. He was up in this avalanche chute up here, above the modern ATV trail. He also took some photos in this really narrow, rocky defile coming off of Dyke Mountain. Again, he's really interested in these dikes. And if you enjoy getting out in the mountains around here, you know these things are all over the place. Like the Chinese wall on the North Fork is just one of these big intrusions. They moved camp down to Sulphur Creek, where a guy named Jack Baronet had a mining camp. And he was another wild character. He was a Montana gold rush guy. He had been in Yellowstone before the park was created in 1872. He built a bridge over Yellowstone River so early miners could get to Cook City. And in 1893, he's just prospecting up in Sunlight because the guy was kind of all over the place. From Baronet's camp, Jaggar went up to the head of Sulphur Creek on the Sulphur Creek Glacier. And these photos are really difficult to recapture because where Jaggar was standing on a glacier is now just rock. So this is all snow. Not much there now. So this is a satellite image of the Sulphur Creek, upper Sulphur Creek area. This is all just a big rock glacier, and they're way up here. Jaggar might have been standing on 20 or 30 feet of ice back in 1893, and now that's mostly gone. So in order to recapture the true perspective of these photos, I would have had to deploy a drone or something, which I think is kind of cheating, because I think showing how this glacier is almost gone after the past 100-some years is more important than getting an accurate photo. So look at this mountain right there. He can get high enough on this ice to see it, and I can't. So this glacier is now mostly just a rock glacier, which means it's kind of a rock, ice-cored rock glacier. So there's still ice in there, but it's underneath all that rock. And I talked to Dr. Noel Potter, who was a geology professor who studied all those rock glaciers in upper Sunlight back in the 70s and 80s. And his research team would drill down into those ice cores of those glaciers. And a few years ago, I was up on Galena Creek Glacier, and I met some scientists from NASA who were testing out rock drilling equipment because they wanted to send this equipment to Mars to look for ice, and they thought that these rock glaciers would have been a similar environment to test this equipment with. This is all ice. Not so much anymore. This is after a recent snow. So they moved their camp down out of Sunlight, up the Clarks Fork a few miles to Camp Creek. This is right where the highway runs through some of those big clearings between Sunlight and Crandall. And they're really interested in the faulting of the Clarks Fork Canyon and the limestone terraces above the river, and the evidence of glaciation everywhere. And Jaggar took photos from this place down here and then down by the river. He's interested in these limestone terraces. So the highway is kind of right in between, the modern highway is right in between here. We just can't see it. Well, obviously we can't see it here, but I know this looks pretty, but this is actually just a mosquito-infested bog. Do not go down there in the spring. I think it's actually for sale right now for $13 million. Literally, it is. He went down Camp Creek into the lower canyon, and I haven't been able to get down here because the trail and the route that he took is now so choked full of deadfall. I value my safety, but I think I found a roundabout way to get down there that might require fording the river a few times and at low water. So we'll see, maybe next summer. They moved camp to the east to Dead Indian Creek, the exact spot where the modern road crosses the creek and where the campground is. And that's where the old road was too, that came down the Beaver Slide from Dead Indian Hill. And while they're camped there, a party of tourists headed to Yellowstone come through. So even back in 1893, you can't escape the constant presence of tourism. They ride out on all these benches above the canyon, which is one of my favorite places to go. Maybe not super cool if you're afraid of heights, but great views of the canyon. That is Sunlight Falls right there. This is in the spring of 2020, I think, and I would just point out this big rock ledge right there. So it was in Jaggar's photos too. And then I took this photo in the spring of 2023 after the floods of 2022, and you can see that slope is just gone. The raging river came around that bend and probably just annihilated that entire slope. And as we all know, those 2022 floods moved around a lot of rock. We know what it did to Yellowstone, and I mean, it did that stuff to the canyon too. It's just not as visible to us. This is taken further to the east. Again, that's Sunlight Falls. I would point out this stick this dead branch right here, because it's still there. Oh, I would also point out the tree cover up here on this hillside. This is where the modern highway runs. This is Russell Creek. So the forest has really expanded 300, 400 yards in places. And that's evident in a lot of these photos. This is looking down the canyon. This is looking across the canyon at Dilworth Bench, where the Switchback Ranch is located. Again, observe the tree cover. And this is looking downstream at the lower canyon. I think this was taken in June 2024. You can see the river's pretty muddy. And they went up Dead Indian Creek, up to the Rattlesnake Divide, and as you can read from this journal excerpt, they went through a bear hunting camp. And I wish he had given more information on this, because it's fascinating. And they camped at a place called Bear Springs, and I've camped here before. It's a good campsite, because this divide was a natural route between Sunlight and the North Fork, and there used to be an old ranger station up there, which was a popular stopover point for travelers. This isn't a Jaggar photo. This was probably taken in the early 1900s, but that's Forest Ranger Frank Sparhawk from the Crandall area. Again, it's a beautiful valley. Obviously, that cabin's gone. And this is also where we start to see the first hints that Jaggar is getting pretty grumpy. He's mad they don't get Sunday off. He's mad they never know he never knows what's going on. And it's really easy for us to have this romantic vision of these old explorations and how wonderful it would have been to be out in the wilderness for 3 months. And the reality is these guys just get sick and tired of it. They get sick and tired of each other. They get tired of being outside. They get tired of moving camp. It's just not a romantic wilderness adventure. It's just work to these people. So keep that in mind when you're reading his journal, or want to go outside. But anyway, Jaggar climbed up this ridge between Trout Peak and Rattlesnake, or that would be Robber's Roost, I think. This is looking to the west at Robber's Roost. I've actually been to this photo location, but dummy that I am, I forgot the original photo to use to line up the photo, so I'll have to go there again. It's my own fault. This is from the same place looking to the north, at the head of Morning Creek. And then this is up on Robber's Roost Peak. You can see Trout Peak back there and the Wall Mountain. And frankly, I'm just too old and fat and slow to get up here, so I'll probably never get this photo. From their camp on the Divide, Jaggar goes up Pat O'Hara Mountain and then down into the head of Rattlesnake Creek, and he takes a few photos down there. And this is really interesting to me. The head of Rattlesnake Creek is this low cirque of crumbly breccia cliffs with all these little little knolls and ponds. And when Jaggar was there, it's this beautiful open meadow. And I was going to go there, and I was like, oh man, this would be such a cool place. And now it's just an overgrown hellhole. He's interested in this breccia bluff back there. You can see the meadow down here. And that is not how it is now. I had to really get creative with this view. They go down Rattlesnake Creek to the Marquette area, and Jaggar takes a few great photos on Rattlesnake Creek. This was the old ranch of Joseph Hunter. It's now the Mooncrest Ranch at the head of Rattlesnake. Hunter was an old prospector out of Red Lodge who had monkeyed around with mining down on the South Fork at Needle Creek, but instead decided to hang out up on Rattlesnake. And he eventually moved to Alaska for the Yukon Gold Rush and lost everything. So you got to know a good thing when you have it. This is the Mooncrest Ranch upper pasture today. A lot more cottonwoods, a lot more irrigation infrastructure put in. This is lower Rattlesnake Creek looking downstream. They're obviously interested in these limestone cliffs and these limestone palisades there. Again, keep an eye on tree growth. So you can see the forest is not only spread out, it's also gotten a lot denser. This is looking up Rattlesnake Creek. Just look at this hillside and this rock. And I'm not an ecologist, so I'm not going to editorialize about what's going on here. But clearly, the absence of forest fires and other issues has really allowed tree growth to go haywire. They head down into what's called Poverty Flats and the little post office of Marquette. This isn't a Jaggar photo, but it's a good photo to show what this area would have looked like before it was flooded by the reservoir. That's Sheep Mountain, the South Fork over there. And they go up the South Fork to the Valley Home Ranch, which later became Valley Ranch. And they meet Mr. Jim McLaughlin here and his wife, Buckskin Jenny. This is a Jaggar photo of Jim McLaughlin in that Valley Ranch pasture. And you can see he's wearing this cool buckskin outfit. And I think that's because McLaughlin was one of the first ranchers in the area to start taking in Eastern guests as hunters and also just as people staying on his ranch. And he knew they didn't want to see people dressed in an overcoat and top hat. They wanted to see a frontiersman, and he was happy to show them what they wanted to see. McLaughlin was from Pennsylvania, and he came out to Wyoming in 1899, trapping and hunting around Sunlight and the North Fork. Until a few years, he and his friend Sam Aldrich settled on the upper South Fork. This is a selfie that Jaggar took out at the McLaughlin Ranch. Kids are taking selfies back in 1893. Can't stop them. This is on September 1st. With McLaughlin as their guide, they headed up the South Fork to the Continental Divide at Marston Pass. And if you've ever been on that trail up the South Fork, you know it can be steep in spots, and I can assure you it was much worse back then. Miners up at Needle Creek had been improving this trail for a number of years before Jaggar was on it. So, I mean, it's gnarly, but it's not that bad. They camp at the mines at Needle Creek, where John Davis, who started the Major Ranch, was already engaged in some mining operations. And then in a few years, he would sort of be managing these mines for Buffalo Bill and George Beck, who never made a profit, but just used the area as a hunting camp. And from these mines at Needle Creek, McLaughlin leads them up the South Fork to Marston Creek and to Marston Pass and the Continental Divide. This is riding up Marston Creek. It wouldn't have been burned in Jaggar's time. And then near the head of Marston Creek is Marston Basin, and they camped here. And the old trail up Marston Pass just went right up the creek in this saddle right here. This is a 1936 map of the Shoshone National Forest, and it shows the old route just straight up Marston Creek. But sometime mid-century, the route was changed in favor of a route that went to the north. This is an 1969 map that shows the route to the north over to the head of the West Fork of Younts Creek. So we had to take this way over here, this thing will work. And they just went straight up here. And Jaggar took some photos on the Continental Divide and by this little lake right there, and then over again on the other Continental Divide. So this is Marston Creek Basin. This is the West Fork of Younts Creek. This is Lost Creek that flows to the Pacific. And then this is the South Fork of the Yellowstone. There's Jim McLaughlin at the old Marston Pass. And there's Corey looking for birds. And if you look down the drainage, you can still see the old trail here. And there's this little lake on the Continental Divide. The Marston drainage is back there. You can see their horses, 2 horses right there. Then on our pack trip, we camped up here by Marston Pass. This is looking down Lost Creek. It was a perfect time to see wildflowers everywhere. I just love this photo because of the flowers. Maybe the bear's okay. This is me trying to reckon a photo location on the divide of the headwaters of the Yellowstone. This is looking south across the Buffalo Plateau. Trying to figure out this photo. There's miles and miles of alpine up there. This is looking back to Marston and the South Fork drainages. And this is Silas and Spencer posing on the Continental Divide ridge with Younts Peak in the background, and they're probably super embarrassed. I'm showing this photo, but they deserve a lot of credit for helping pull off this trip, so thanks. And on our trip, we rode over the divide to the North Fork of Yellowstone, right between Younts Peak and Thoroughfare Mountain here. But that's not the way that Jaggar went. They backtracked and went down the South Fork, and I'm not really sure why they did that. Certainly, Jim McLaughlin was familiar enough with the country to know about the route that we took, and it wouldn't have been anything that would not have been passable in their day. So I really don't know. I think they kind of wanted to go back to the ranch and have a little bit more comfort, maybe get some, non-game meat. I don't know. They went back to the mines on Needle Creek, where they investigated all the mineralogy around there for a couple days, and they go back down the South Fork Canyon to Valley Ranch. And along the way, Jaggar takes a few photos along the trail. This is Geyser Mountain, and I think that's Fall Creek right there. This is right along the trail. These talus cones, which everyone loves a big talus cone. And you can see the lip of the cliff right here that drops down to the river. And these photo locations are super easy to find because they're right along the trail, the exact route that Jaggar took, except the avalanche chute that he sort of climbed up to get this photo is more filled in with trees, so I couldn't really get as high as he did without, getting my view blocked by tree cover. You can barely see a couple of our horses down there, just for perspective. And then this one is actually a bit north of the Majo Ranch and Cabin Creek, right along the road. I couldn't quite get exactly to this location because it would have required going on like 20 yards of private property. And then they go back with McLaughlin to Valley Ranch. They spend a couple of days looking around the South Fork. They move their camp down to Ishua, and they interact with what at that time was the Upper Belknap Ranch, a little ways downriver from Ishua. And a few years later, this would be Buffalo Bill's T.E. Ranch, but at this point, he's not around yet. And then they head up Ishua Creek en route to the Thoroughfare. Now, the modern, most direct way that you all know to get from the South Fork to the Thoroughfare is over Deer Creek, but in 1893, that trail didn't exist yet. Jim McLaughlin, Nova Brown, O.D. Marks, guys who had ranches right around Deer Creek, they built Deer Creek to have a more direct access to Yellowstone, to the Thoroughfare. So you didn't have to go all the way around. So the Ishua route was the original way, because that's where the animal migrations are. That's the route the Indians took. There's already a trail there. Although, as Jaggar says, it probably wasn't the best. And he takes a few photos along the trail and one up at Ishua Pass. This is looking up Ishua Creek. And they said there was some rain and snow the day they took this, which I think affected visibility. And this is looking downstream. I think some of those logs are still there. And this is looking across the canyon towards Scoria Creek. And I would point out this dead tree right here that sort of branches off to the left, and then this tree. That tree is dead, and this other big dead branch is still there. And all those benches on the other side of the canyon, again, just a lot more tree cover. This is up at Ishua Pass. That is Ishua Cone. And you can see a couple of horses right there. And I was really interested in this rock cairn that was already up at the pass in 1893. Oh, so here's the rephotograph. Again, a lot more trees. You're not surprised at this point. And when I enlarge this photo, you can see this cairn that's up there. And you can't see it from the original photograph or the original rephotograph because of the tree cover, but that cairn is still right there. And this is the trail in the foreground. So they come over Ishua Pass and head down Pass Creek to the confluence of the Thoroughfare. And whereas Ishua Creek is this nasty, narrow cat trail, Pass Creek is this beautiful open valley for much of its length. And they camp at the confluence with the Thoroughfare, and the next day, Jaggar and Hague go up to the head of the head of the Thoroughfare, and up there they meet an elk hunting camp where there are some local guides and visiting hunters, and these folks are Sam Aldrich, who homesteaded on the South Fork, what later became the J-Bar 9, right by where Aldrich Creek is. Some guy named Two Dog Jack. You gotta love these names. Billy Hoffer, who was an early Yellowstone guy. He was Theodore Roosevelt's guide in the Two Ocean Country. And then a guy named Tazewell Woody, another Yellowstone character. He's Australian. And Woody Creek on Upper Thoroughfare is named after Tazewell Woody, because he used to hang out there a lot or something. Here, John Anderson, the cook, shot an elk nearby, and these guys help him process this elk and get the carcass back to camp. And then Jaggar takes a few photos near this bluff at the mouth of Pass Creek. This is looking upstream. This is Butte Creek towards the Deer Creek Pass over there. You can see that the creek has kind of changed course a little bit, but that's to be expected. This is looking downstream. This is Pass Creek right here in the Thoroughfare, in the foreground, and then this is the Thoroughfare. Again, quite a bit overgrown. And this is looking northwest across Pass Creek to those meadows where they would have camped. And that's exactly where we camp too. It's the natural campsite. You can see our horses there. And this is a big glacial embankment right at the mouth of Pass Creek. And maybe that's where we'll end it today. I think I've gone on for long enough. From this Pass Creek camp, they went over to Open Creek and then down the Thoroughfare and into Yellowstone and through all the Yellowstone roads back to Bozeman. And they came back in 1897. They took a kind of a different route, which we're not going to talk about, but I didn't talk about it because Jaggar took a lot less photos that year. So obviously a lot of people I want to thank here. People who helped me with this project, talked to me about the photos, and people who have been out with me on my wild goose chases trying to locate these photo locations, which I know sometimes wasn't super fun for everybody, trying to bushwhack through a bunch of nasty tree cover. Obviously want to thank 7D Outfitting and me, Dominic, and Silas Ward and Spencer Strike for making this pack trip happen, Mooncrest Ranch for letting me take photos on their land, and then the Wyoming Historical Society for supporting an unconventional project like this. So just in ending, I just want to say landscapes are constantly changing. I think we all know that. And these photos show that a few aspects of the Absarokas have changed, but a lot of things have really stayed the same. These photos don't show a radical transformation of the environment. And change is natural. Sometimes it happens gradually over centuries. Sometimes it happens overnight with a flood or a fire. But there is no such thing as one correct or pristine fixed state that environment should be judged against. That just doesn't exist. And I think what's important is that we protect the natural processes that keep these landscapes healthy: clean water, clean air, wildlife habitat, thoughtful human development that doesn't destabilize the integrity of all these well-preserved places. So I'll get off my soapbox, and thank you very much for coming to this. I'll be done now.